The business, motherfucker.
The Daily Read. Your source for news, politics, sports, and all things trending. Here's your host, Marcus Gentry.
This year's presidential election is about choices. Donald Trump is making it very clear exactly what he'll do if reelected, especially when it comes to race and immigration. On the campaign trail, Trump has falsely accused migrants of a, quote, border bloodbath and uses dehumanizing language when he talks about them.
They're sending prisoners, murderers, drug dealers, mental patients, and terrorists, the worst they have in every country, all over the world. The Democrats say, please don't call them animals. They're humans. I said, no, they're not humans. They're not humans. They're animals.
Trump. And his allies are also threatening to carry out mass deportations, use migrant detention camps, and potentially bring back the zero tolerance policy that put children in cages. This week, Trump attended a gala for the director of the Family Separation Program and hasn't ruled out reinstating it. And while Trump's attacks on asylum seekers are certainly racist, there's so much more. Have you heard about his plans to uplift only white people? Axios reports that Trump wants the Justice Department to roll back protections for people of color to focus on discrimination against whites. Trump's allies have already been testing this anti-DEI framework in court and managed to block billions in pandemic relief for women and minority-owned businesses. There's one mastermind behind all these cruelty-is-the-point policies, and his name isn't Donald Trump. Meet Stephen Miller, the former Trump White House advisor and far-right extremist plotting Trump's nightmarish second term. Joining me now, MSNBC political contributor Jelani Cobb. He's a staff writer for The New Yorker and dean of the Columbia Journalism School. Also with me is investigative journalist Jean Guerrero. She's the author of Hate Monger, Stephen Miller, Donald Trump, and the White Nationalist Agenda. Jean, Jelani, thank you both very much for coming to the Saturday show. Jean, help us understand Stephen Miller's ideology. What's his vision for America?
His vision is a white nationalist America, and this agenda that you described is something that he's been dreaming about for a very long time. In my book, I trace how Miller was radicalized as a teenager by far-right provocateurs who believed that racism against Black and brown people was not a problem, and that the real problem in American society was racism against whites. This is an idea that originated with white supremacists like David Duke, who in the 1970s was calling white men the, quote, real second-class citizens in America. But while back then it was largely rejected and fringe, in 2024 it's mainstream GOP politics, thanks to Stephen Miller.
Mm-hmm. And Jelani, Miller's law firm released this ad in October 2022. Listen to this.
When did racism against white people become okay? Progressive corporations, airlines, universities all openly discriminate against white Americans. Racism is always wrong. The left's anti-white bigotry must stop. We are all entitled to equal treatment under law.
Jelani, the floor is yours.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I would point your viewers to a body of scholarly work that examines these very questions about the ways in which anti-discrimination policy can be utilized against the group that has historically been subject to discrimination, and for the group that has historically benefited from that discrimination. The name of that body of scholarship, if you want to guess and you haven't already, is critical race theory. And so this is a kind of textbook example of this very thing. I do want to make one point about the earlier question, which is that this is part of a much older tradition. This is the mythology of the lost cause, how Confederates, after the end of the Civil War, actually envisioned themselves, people who had fought a war for the right to buy, sell, rape, abuse, traffic, and exploit human beings, envisioned themselves as the victims. And that came about in the immediate aftermath of the war. If you look at the debates of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, one of the more notable things you hear is this same strain. Southern legislator after Southern legislator gets up and says that they are opposed to discrimination and therefore they cannot support the 1964 Civil Rights Act because they believe it discriminates against white people. And it's that same kind of playbook. So this is not a novel development. This is something that we've seen for a really long time.
Mm-hmm. You know what, Gene, I was going to jump to an immigration question, but given what Jelani just said, I'm just wondering, how has Miller been preparing to overhaul the Justice Department?
Well, primarily it's been through his America First legal nonprofit, which has focused on dismantling programs that are meant to benefit historically underrepresented and historically marginalized communities, such as programs benefiting Black farmers or women-owned and minority-owned restaurants. And my prediction is that in a second Trump term, based on everything that Miller has been doing through America First Legal, we would not only see the Department of Justice weaponized to dismantle affirmative action programs benefiting people of color across the country, we would also see the creation of an affirmative action agenda focused on benefiting white people.
And Jelani, then what would it mean to lose the Justice Department as a backstop on safeguarding civil rights?
I mean, it would be a rearguard march, no question. What would happen would be a kind of open season for any kind of equitable policy or practice. Anything that has addressed the legacy and impact of unequal treatment, of inequality, discrimination, and so on, would be vulnerable in that regard. And so that's what that world might look like.
And Stephen Miller would be at the center of it all. Jelani Cobb, Jean Guerrero, thank you both very much for coming to the Saturday Show.
Hey everyone, MSNBC has a new and improved app. You'll get real-time alerts and analysis live.
He knows what needs to be done. Make America great again.
And his rhetoric continues to polarize the country.
President Trump using an ugly, vulgar expression that is racist.
So I don't understand what the sin is. What's good for us? Are we allowed to ask that question? Or is that racist?
Build the wall.
But the politics of division aren't new.
Build the wall.
5 decades ago, populist appeals fueled the rise of another controversial politician, George Wallace, whose story ended in a way no one expected.
Well, Wallace was a good politician. He knew how to play the game. And maybe more to the point, he would use anything to play that game.
I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
B. Drummond Ayers covered Wallace for the New York Times 50 years ago.
Race was everything with Wallace. Whatever he did had a racial element to it.
But Ayers says Wallace didn't start out that way when he first ran for governor in 1958.
He started out traditionally, roads, schools, and so forth. One of his opponents started talking about race itself, blacks and whites, and he beat Wallace. And that's when he changed and said he'd never be beaten again.
In 1963, as governor of Alabama, he rose to prominence by defying President John F. Kennedy.
The governor is adamant. He made a campaign promise to stand in the doorway himself to prevent the integration of the last all-white state university.
The race element was the biggest thing in the South, and segregation was the biggest element in the racial factor. Wallace just played it. He wrote it. It was about the only thing he did because he wasn't particularly interested in issues.
The best thing I know to do is to let Dixie introduce George Wallace.
When Wallace ran for president, he carried that issue to the national stage.
Don't worry about what the newspapers say about us. They call us extremists and want to say we are fascists. Well, I want to tell these newspapers something. These large newspapers who think they know more than the average citizen on the street in New York, you haven't always been right.
Afterward,
Many left humming Dixie and shouting white power.
Wallace made opposing federal mandates to integrate schools and neighborhoods a centerpiece of his presidential campaigns.
Why are more and more millions of Americans turning to Governor Wallace? Follow as your children are bused across town.
Chaos exists in this country in the public school system because of busing. Everybody knows that, so I'm not bringing on any chaos. Busing's bringing on chaos.
Them is the word. We don't want them in our schools. We don't want to be on the bus with them. We don't want them living next to us.
And he lit a spark under a swath of American voters who felt ignored.
He's our kind of man, our kind of man. George Wallace is our kind of man.
As he always puts it, he speaks for the truck driver, the beautician, the policeman, and other members of the so-called working class.
I like that man. He tells you what, he tells you the truth. That's what it is.
And it is true that the liberal, educated, academic, journalistic, professional, intellectual circles seem not much interested in the white working class.
He is not a racist. That's definite.
I'm going to vote for George Wallace because he says what I like to hear.
Wallace understood that there were people who were hurting, struggling, losing jobs. He tapped into that and appealed to that because the folks that are struggling often feel put upon. Wallace played that to the hilt.
I did represent more of the average citizen in this country than did any other candidate, based on the fact that the man who works each day for a living and pays the taxes and holds the country together has been ignored, except on Election Day.
We won't ever know how far he might have gone had he not been shot. But after he got shot, over a few years, all of a sudden, he had an epiphany, it seems.
Times were changing, and Wallace, who at that point had been Alabama governor for much of the past decade, understood he had to change with them.
The turning point, when everybody realized that he was turning, was the crowning of the homecoming queen.
Congratulations here, you're a mighty pretty queen here.
Thank you.
She bends down and he puts a crown on her and holds her, both of her hands like that. It made the evening news. And very shortly after that, if not the same weekend, Wallace met with the Southern black leaders in Alabama because he was in another campaign at that point and he needed their votes.
Some blacks are willing to talk now about supporting a Wallace candidacy.
And I think that what men do in the future, as far as improving the quality of life for all citizens, be they black or white, is really what's going to determine whether or not that was a great man or an effective man, not so much what he did in the past.
He made apologies, asked for forgiveness, and in fact, Martin Luther King's father came in and actually prayed with him. And he went to the grave still apologizing, still saying he was wrong, still saying he was trying to do something for black folks. And in fact, he was at that point. He would do things as a governor that would help blacks because the worm had turned on this issue.
It would take him 20 years to abandon the politics of race, but in 1982, when he came out to run for governor once again, he won with crucial black support. Blacks had acquired political power. Now he needed them.
If you want to be cynical, and I can be cynical about George Wallace, what it says about him is that he would play anything with the race angle to get votes.
I made a mistake, and that's all pay in the past, and I'm sorry that I did that because it gave the wrong opinion of the kind of man that I was.
Only the good Lord knows whether or not he was sincere.
The business, motherfucker.
The Daily Read.
Business.